This episode is sponsored by Exponentially. Supercharge your innovation process and get certified as a world-class pretotyper with the official Learn Pretotyping online course. Sign up using the code OG100 for $100 off. You can learn from Exponentially CEO and master pretotyper Leslie Berry and develop your own pretotype with personal feedback from Leslie. You'll also gain access to the Exponentially app, an enterprise-level tool to help you keep track of your pretotypes, and join an exclusive Slack community of certified pretotypers. Sign up today at www.exponentially.com/learn-pretotyping and use the code OG100 for $100 off. Welcome to the official Pretotyping podcast with your hosts, Jonathan Sun and Robert Scrove.
How's it going today, listeners? So today, we're going to get into some of our own updates in our personal pretotyping world before sharing some popular questions within the Slack community and answering them on air. So to kick it off, Robert, what's your pretotype of this month?
So this is the month of March, and getting into the new one, I think the pretotype that I'm literally doing is a Clubhouse conference. Now, I wouldn't say I've made an XYZ hypothesis yet, but I'm actually formulating what it could be. And then the idea later on is how successful can it be is where I'll take the XYZ hypothesis. So in a nutshell, the Clubhouse conference that we're doing is called Voices of Clubhouse. And literally, it's a 24-hour event that's going to be happening, looks like on May 22nd, where we're inviting a lot of people that we know in our networks to come join and host a particular room at a particular time. Depending on where they are in their time zone, they would host the room, go through the motions of asking questions to guest hosts, or just doing a simple Q&A on the topics that they care about the most. The idea being is that this would provide the blueprint for future events, but the XYZ that would be corresponding to this is that, let's say, 10% of all Clubhouse attendees would eventually visit a Clubhouse room or something to that effect. I haven't worked it out, but I have to kind of look at the metrics and what would be reasonable to do. But the idea is that we're creating a sort of conference metaphor around the Clubhouse app and using that to bring people together that have a common interest in a topic. So that would be probably my yet slightly undefined pretotype that I'm going to be launching this month.
That sounds awesome. And it's funny that you mentioned that because the pretotype that I've been running this month is also related to Clubhouse, but it relates to more of a Clubhouse format change. So basically, I run a Monday night show in GMT called Odin Talks, where basically in the past, what I did was I used it as kind of like a pitch session, me and one of the co-founders of Odin. And we used this kind of like an opportunity to get people to pitch their startups, and kind of like the startups that we really liked, we were going to post in our deal flow. Slowly, the attendance started dwindling, so we thought to ourselves, we need a big change. So I kind of tested out a pretotype, which was if I changed the format from a pitch session to interviews with founders, my engagement rate would go up 20 to 30%. And my engagement rate went up way more than 20 or 30%. It went up by 400 or 500%. Whereas in the past, I would only have five people watching my room. Nowadays, I consistently get about 25 or 30. So to me, that pretotype was a smashing success.
Very cool. So now that we've kind of gone into the pretotypes we've both done, are we off to Q&A and kind of covering some of the things we've been seeing in the Slack room?
Yep, let's do it.
So why don't you start with the first one? I think it's like how to pretotype a really expensive and hard to build business idea.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to pretotyping, I think my default methods that I use if I don't know how to, like, for example, like manually try to carry it out is using like either the fake door landing page, or even trying to do the video method, the YouTube pretotype, where it's like you do like kind of like an animated video off of like Puntoon or something like that, and just showcasing what it's like, followed by an email sign up. Now, somebody in our community was really, really creative and suggested that that you can actually get skin in the game by getting somebody to go to a 2-hour intro session on that hyper, expensive or hard to build business idea. And the idea behind that is that nothing kills ideas more than like having to go to a meeting unless they really, really want it, which is really, really interesting to me. What do you think of that phenomenon?
I don't think I'm in agreement with that, because one of the things that you're trying to do is create the kind of environment that would encourage engagement. And I think that the word meeting is something that everyone connotates to a forced kind of engagement. I wouldn't go that route personally. I would probably find another avenue, but I can see the logic behind the rationale.
Yeah, I guess so. I think in the end of the day, a landing page and a video, there's no failing with like a landing page or a video. These are like the two easiest prototypes that one can run. Now, Robert, I'm curious. What are your thoughts on using Facebook ads for prototyping?
I think for people that are first starting out, they should stay away from ads altogether. I am exploring the option of interviewing the target audience, one person from your target audience that's in your network, interviewing them on what you're doing and not seeking opinion, but seeing if they understand at face value what you're offering, what it is, fact based kind of interview, and then asking for money right then and there. Your influence may tip the scales in terms of them purchasing something, but I would argue that they're still going to evaluate what you're giving them and potentially either buying it or not buying it. If you take the percentages of the success of most prototypes being less than 10%, there's a good chance that no one you meet is going to, or no one that you talk to that's in your network that you think is in your target audience is going to buy it. However, the one thing you will get that you won't get anywhere else is the what would you buy instead for this? Would you buy anything? And keep it as fact based as you can without opinion. And I think that's where most people need to start, because I see a lot of people struggle, and I've seen this in the Global Virtual Design Sprint, with setting up ads on different platforms, with understanding the analytics involved, with the amount of work that needs to happen to create something that's somewhat believable in that space and get the right people that you need to get. Facebook groups tend to be very closed, so they don't allow in-person advertising if they don't know who you are, even if you're offering something free. So I'm working on an article that's going to explain how to do that, given my background in user research. And I think there's validity in bucking the trend of trying to go with the quant always and trying to get just nothing but data feeds, and going after the qual, but making sure that you stay away from opinion-based answers and go after fact-based. Do you understand what is being presented to you? And is this something you will purchase right now, or that you will sign up for, or whatever it is? And making sure that you stay pretty rigid in that regard, because people will always want to relate or fall back into it. That's at least my point of view. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Um, I think it works sometimes. Kind of depends because I think, too many people think of like Facebook ads as like sort of like a spray and pray type of strategy. I think if you use Facebook ads in the sense that like you use it to like really, really narrow exactly the types of people that would like use your potential product or service, then I guess it would be somewhat effective. But I do think that like probably the best way to figure out, at least if you're going online to try to figure out whether or not you should validate your product or service idea, is that you should try to find like a curated group of people that are like within your target market. So say for example, if you're trying to prototype like a brand new childcare service idea, what you want to do is like, rather than like try to run like Facebook ads on like just like everybody that's like age 35 and up, what you should do is like go on Facebook or like Mighty Networks and to just try to find groups of parents that try to talk to each other, parents of like under fives, and then try to see what kind of engagement you get on your proposed innovative childcare service, and see how much skin in the game you get on that.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Cool. So so the next question is, in a fake door prototype, how do you know why people didn't interact so that you know what to change?
I don't know if the why is the right question because you're not going to know the why. The why is usually qualitative, but you're with a fake door, you're really just either doing a positive or a negative, like either an engagement or a non-engagement. Unless you're actually asking for the information during the acquisition or the engagement process, you aren't going to know. You're just going to really have to fall back onto your assumptions on why you thought it was going to work and not work, and then keep that focus there because ultimately it's going to be your assumptions that are going to lead you in certain directions. So if there's data to suggest that some assumptions were invalid versus ones that were validated, that's basically what you can build on. And so again, unless you're providing those mechanisms to capture that qualitative data from users, I don't think you can really know why.
For me, I think it depends where you ran your experiment, right? Because I think that like if you ran your experiment within a community where you knew one or two people, for example, I think like a way that you can figure out why people it didn't interact with either your website or like your what's it called your morsel book or like any sort of other prototype like that. Um, I think a good way is just to like after a few days of them like having had a chance to look through the prototype, you can go ahead and DM them and ask them, okay, like, hey, like what did you think of this and this and this? And then more times or not, depending on like how much you trust them, they'll generally give you like an honest answer, something along the lines of like like the product or service didn't really look that appealing to me, right? You press them on the question, and then it's either there's big problems with the product or service idea, in which case you go back and you try to come up with something else, or maybe you just designed it poorly, so in which case you go and try to fix up some design elements, such as cut out some text, put some more visualization, little things like that. So I mean, I think sometimes your prototype doesn't always go the way you expect it, sometimes not always because you don't have a product or service that's not in demand, but because you didn't present it in a certain way.
The problem I have with that is that you have to actually get more than 3 or 4 or 5 people to start saying the same thing before you start seeing a trend. Even if there's a high level of trust with your target audience and the person you're talking to, and they tell you their opinion about why they did or did not engage, it's isolated, and you're still getting an opinion. So what the danger in that is that as the organizer or the prototype, if you really trust this person, you may go completely 100% in with what they're talking about, and they may be flat out wrong. It's just their impression of what they think is right and not right about your prototype. If you really do want to harness opinion, the best way to do it is to ask multiple people who have gotten an impression of what you're doing and seeing if there's a pattern. If multiple people say your front page is using bright red text that blinks, that turns me off, that's probably going to give you a clue as to probably going in a different direction with the graphics. If the copy is confusing because you're using too much acronyms, if you only hear it from one person out of 5, maybe it's not that confusing for your target audience. But if you talk to that one person first and say, I have no idea what ACYM means, and you take that as gospel, you may be kind of pigeonholing yourself into a rewrite or a reconsideration that actually encourages you to will kind of get you in a position where you have to experiment even more than you necessarily need to. So I'll revisit the earlier question in that I think asking why is a pitfall. It's a trap. You really, all you're doing is you want to understand the experience pre and post acquisition, especially if they buy. I think it's more valuable to ask why after they've done the transaction. It's still going to be an opinion. It still probably won't have as much weight as you want, but the why, answering the why after the post will basically speak to your assumptions more about why you did what you had in the prototype and if they're validated or invalidated. That's where I think it's more valuable, but not before, especially if they don't engage. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree on like the after part, and I probably should have been a little bit more clear while I was like explaining. But like I also do agree. I think that that you do want to try to ask more than one person to try to get like an overall answer trend, rather than like, isolate like a single person's answer, right? Because I think that like there is, I do agree with the notion that like sometimes there is a lot of danger, with single people's answers, right? Like sometimes you have your occasional contrarians that you got a lot of people saying the same thing. You got this like one guy that's like, for whatever reason he or she thinks like really really differently. So like, I definitely agree with you on the getting multiple people's feedback, I should say, rather than sticking to one person. Um,
So, Jonathan, what do you think is the average amount of time needed to run a prototype?
um, I think well, it really depends on the prototype. I think the way I usually do it is the way I think of the amount of time to run a prototype is you should run them as fast as you can without compromising, I think, the general integrity of like what you want your product or service idea to be, right? And we kind of like, I think, allude to this a little bit in our previous podcast about just kind of like um straddling, I think, trying to find that balance between like believability and roughness. um so I think, for example, like if you're trying to create a prototype for a bookshop, right? Then basically, what's the process of prototyping a bookshop, right? You get a big cardboard. You can cut out a door, and then draw a window, and kind of like pretend that this is like a bookshop of some sort, and then kind of like pretend that the um and then you have a table outside of like kind of like a fake store frame, and you invite people to come give their email addresses for like when this hypothetical bookstore will open. In this case, I would imagine that to construct the cardboard frame should probably take you 1 to 2 hours. And then in terms of how much you should probably sit outside, you should probably pick a fairly busy day, and then you should probably do it around, you say each round of experiment lasts 1 day. You should probably do it for about 5 days with 1 day spaced out in between, so so people don't really catch on to the pattern, and then you pick a different spot on the high street every time, and then so that, if you add it all together, it amounts to about 10 days for 5 experiments. And so that's like one example I would give. But for a landing page, I mean, I think, say, for example, you use card.co, and then you can build that out in 30 minutes to an hour. And then you post it in 3 or 4 different groups, and you use those as like different kind of like different rounds of experiments. Then you should be able to get results of your rounds of experiments within like 1 to 2 days. So that's kind of like what I think, my opinion on like how much time is needed to run a prototype. But what are your thoughts?
When I originally asked this question to Alberto Savoia, he interpreted it as duration, meaning that the amount of time a prototype has to sit in the market to basically get some data. His answer was is that if you have a big enough sample, it can be a few hours. So when he mentioned the early days of Google, where he used to run 1% experiments or experiments on 1% of their users and collect conclusive data from 10,000 users in hours, so that they had a large sample size to make a judgment call or an evaluation. For someone that's just starting with prototyping or doing it themselves, it could be a lot longer because your sample size is going to be a lot fewer. So I would say Echo is thought that the duration would probably be contingent on the type of prototype you do. Uh, but I would think that if you find the right audience and you have enough bandwidth, meaning that you have enough people that are paying attention to it, your sample size and to get the percentage you're looking for that's meaningful, it's probably self-defined. I would say it depends on the prototyper. It depends on who you are. What's going to be enough false false to positive ratios for you? Like, it would be 100 people that have an impression of what you did. Would it be 1,000 people? Where do you draw the line? And do you draw the line at time? Like, you just give it 48 hours, no matter what the numbers are, you basically make those calls, those judgment calls. I usually default to 48 hours because it would speak not only to the execution of the prototype, but whether or not you're targeting properly, especially if your numbers are low, so that you don't have to wait a whole week to get to the get the 10 number. You know right off the bat if you're in the right space. In stock trading, there's a analogy around volume, where the more volume a stock has, like an index or something else, the more it's going to move, which is more advantageous for the stock trader because they live and thrive on the stock price going up and down to make a profit. And it's just probably the same thing with prototyping, in that you need a healthy amount of bandwidth and enough movement, whether positive or negative, to understand whether your prototype has value to your end customer. So to Alberto's point, it's a bit of a general question, but it's, if you're really looking at a certain number of people to engage your prototype, you have to make sure you're in the right space and you have enough volume, meaning you have enough people that are coming through the pipeline to take a first impression judgment call at what you're putting in front of them to say, okay, I'm going to engage this, or I'm going to move on and try something else.
Yeah. And I think Alberto gave a really, really good answer, right? It all depends on the type of project that you're running. But obviously, you try to the best of your ability, run them as enough of a duration that you can get the quality data that you need, but at the same time, duration not so long as to kind of like put yourself in a position where you don't run as many experiments as you should be running. Um, Now, with that being said, I'm kind of curious. Do you think that you should jump to pricing directly when running prototype experiments to get skin in the game, or should you test for email address sign up and gradually progress to pricing?
Depends on the person who's doing the experiments. Some people don't feel morally comfortable with asking for a price on something that doesn't exist. Others feel that a lower skin in the game of just getting somebody's email address is enough to send a signal that there could be interest there. So I think it really depends on the prototyper and the disposition of that person in terms of testing the markets. I will say that for people that experiment regularly, people that in marketing agencies, people in tech have no qualms with doing this, especially if it involves free samples of product, or it's being in a beta group to basically test out new products, but you have to pay. They go strictly by the numbers and don't have much emotion that goes into it. At least that's what I'm learning by being on Clubhouse all this time, is that they look at it as very black and white. So my answer would be is that it really depends on the person.
It's interesting because I remember in the early days of my startup journey, I remember going to like a startup roundtable where basically like one of the most this was back when I was a student at the University of Washington, and one of the most prominent kind of like startup ecosystem builders in the region, who also doubled as an angel investor as well, basically just sat around and gave us advice on like all the questions that we had. One of them was ironically this, right? How much traction do you need to prove that how much traction do you need to prove that that your product is worth building? His answer was 100 paying customers. And I think when he first said that, I was like, I was like, I think my mind was blown and I was puzzled because I was just like, geez, how on earth am I going to get 100 paying customers for something that doesn't exist? And then his rationale was, if your value proposition is so compelling, you should be able to get 100 paying customers at whatever price you set, no problem. Which was, I think it was a hot take at that time, but I think the more I mull over it, it makes sense. And then like there's an enhance, the reason why less than 10% of business ideas actually turn out to become a successful product.
I think in order to meet that 100 sale marker, you need to have a wealth of experience behind you. Somebody who's a college graduate and trying to get 100 sales of something really has to find the gold nugget at the bottom of the well, like basically digging to the extreme degree to find something. So they have to put in a ton of work to get to that point. The silver bullet rarely exists. If it does, it's usually because they're leveraging the knowledge and expertise or the position of somebody else who's already done the work for them. So I push back on that notion a little bit of 100 sales, because you probably won't get that kind of result unless you're very aware of what the trends are, what industries are very hot, how you're networked with other people that know how to execute, and what your own body of experience is like. There's a lot of factors that go into that end result of just 100 sales. So it's a loaded answer because it makes it seem like you just need to find that one thing that will get you across that 100 sale threshold. Because in all honesty, if somebody gets to that point and they're not experienced in how to handle it, it won't matter if they get to that point.
I think so. I think so. I mean, I think you're right. Right. It kind of depends. Like, it kind of depends what skin in the game that you're targeting, and like what you personally deem to be, like, I think enough, right? Because I do think that, like, the more you think about it, 100 sales is very, very difficult to achieve, especially if you're like running a prototype of something.
Yep. And Jonathan, that's all the time I have today for Q&A. Do you want to close it out? Because we've got, both of us have got a jet for other things, but I think it's been a good session so far with what we've been able to cover. And I know we're going to do this again in the future, but is there anything else you'd like to kind of cover before we close out?
I want to say something.
Not really. Oh man. Yeah. Yeah. Comment down below if you guys want to hear part 2 of the Q&A. So depending on y'all's responses, we may or may not do a part 2 of this. As always, if you guys want to hear more about podcasts, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Spotify and share it with your friends. Remember, guys, feel Ferrari fast, McDonald's cheap.